So will you please welcome to the stage Amina Mohammed, who's the Special Advisor on Post-2015 Development Planning to the United Nations Secretary General. Hello, Amina. Also Jonathan Shrier, who's Special Representative for Global Food Security with the United States Department of State. And Tony Lake, the Executive Director of UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. And Dyborn Chibonga, who's Chief Executive of NASFAM, the National Smallholder Farmers Association of Malawi. I'll give you each a kind of a minute to make an opening statement. You've been listening as we've been listening to the discussions that have been going on here. And I think a lot of people, and certainly over lunch this is what I noticed, a lot of people, there's a sense of frustration, a sense of, you know, there's so much that needs changing, there's such a sense of urgency, and we feel this coming from the hall. And you know, we've heard all this talk about 2015 development review and sustainable development goals and getting one set of goals, and it seems, you know, that on the ground there's one set of problems, and here we have this great big process over here. How do you think we can link them better and make them more effective, more responsive? Because there was a lot of taram, you know, when the Millennium Development Goals were unveiled. How do we come up with goals that are going to make more of a difference? Amina, maybe you would start with that.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think first let's finish the job we started out to do. I think let's not be in a hurry to get to where we need to get to without remembering that we have some unfinished business. And I think from that, we can carry forward a more genuine conversation. This is the first time we've had a conversation for the development agenda, so that there is so much noise is not a bad thing. I think we will have to clarify and narrow it down eventually, because what we do want is an agenda that we can drive forward and be bigger and better. So I think it would be finish the business that we have to do now and engage with the conversation that's happening. I think that we still have more to do at the ground level. We're saying bottom up, but I think we're also going to have to say top down. At the end of the day, it's going to be our governments that take this decision. And how we influence them in this conversation, I think this time the paradigm shift will be, it must be influenced by what the people want.
Jonathan?
I think we need to just start where this conference started, which is bearing in mind that hunger has a human face. Often a rural resident, often a woman, and that undernutrition likewise has a human face, generally a child and its mother. And if we start there and take on board the learning that's gone on in recent years, where the global community and national communities have really learned a lot about how to address food security better, how to address undernutrition better, we'll get a long way towards solutions and towards goals that set us on those solution paths better.
Tony.
First of all, I thought those reports were wonderful, and they captured the sense of urgency that I have felt everywhere for the last 2 days, and that is so important. And if I could say to my friend David Nabarro, for a stunted child or for somebody living in a zone that is being hammered by climate change, there is no alternative, and we must make the progress that we can, even as we think about a very interesting question that David posed. If I may, let me look at all of what we've been talking about through the prism of nutrition and stunting specifically. Stunting has to be in the 2015 post-2015 agenda, as my friend Amina knows. It is both a marker of progress because it is produced by all of the things that we've been talking about in this conference. I could go on and on. You've been dealing with them. And it's a maker of progress because there is no more cost-effective intervention that we can make to promote growth and human welfare than through addressing, in my view, undernutrition and in the view of so many people. How do we do it? We can do it by acting on what we know, how to fix stunting. The science is there, the programs are there. It's a question of political will. How do we all create that political will? For me, I brought my talking points here, if you will allow me. This is a t-shirt which is barely readable because I've worn it so often and washed it so often, that was given to me years ago, and it says on it, educate, agitate, and organize. And educate. People don't know enough about stunting, and we have to educate them. Conferences like this can do it, but we can do it at the local level through all of your networks and all of your efforts. We need to agitate. We need to get to politicians. We need to get to the political leadership and insist that nutrition and all the other issues that you've been discussing we get to, and before we can agitate with them, we have to agitate and be agitated with ourselves. And our super champion here, Jay Naidu, is in the Sun movement, one of the great agitators. If you take off his shirt, you will find under his shirt another shirt that is blue and red with a big S on it for Superman. And this, our super champion. And I would note that Superman is the great crime fighter, and stunting is a crime for children. And finally, organize. And one of the most interesting things happening, as well as important in the field of nutrition, of course, is the Sun movement, which David is at the center of. The Sun movement is not a top-down movement, an organization. It is driven by its many networks, including and especially, and I was so pleased to see so many NGOs here, both local and international, especially in many ways the NGO network from around the world. And to conclude, yesterday at our launch of a UNICEF report, afterwards, I was so pleased when our friends from Tanzania, where are you? Yes. When our friends from Tanzania surrounded me because I had said that we had been very impressed with the fact that 180, I said, local NGOs were at work on nutrition throughout Tanzania on stunting and advocating, educating, agitating, et cetera. And afterwards they surrounded me and said, "You're wrong, you misheard on the phone. It was 280, and I had disempowered 100 NGOs just in misspeaking." And their agitation and their energy inspired me and gave me all the more energy. And the point is that if you can't get energy from all the people in the local areas working on this, and if you can't be energized about something like nutrition, you're simply not concentrating.
Tony, thank you. And thank you for filling us in, by the way, on what so many of the men in the hall are wearing underneath their jackets and tops. That's very, very nice to know. Dyborn, I won't ask you what you're wearing underneath your lovely shirt, but please tell us, from the point of view of the people you represent, the farmers you represent, what does all this post-2015 goals, review, development, sustainable, what does that mean to them? What would you say to them about all this when you go home?
Basically, they are at the center of production, and agriculture has to be at the center of the development agenda. And without the smallholder farmers, it will not happen. They have to be empowered, they must be helped to form collective groups that can really treat farming as business. And given the right sort of support, they can be able to deal with hunger, produce nutritious food, and deal with the issues of climate change.
And do you think that they feel that what happens at the United Nations, what happens at these big global conferences where they talk about those things, do you think they feel that they're really connected to that in any way?
Sometimes they feel a bit disconnected, but I think all of us have to realize that we're in this together, developing nations and developed nations, CSOs, NGOs, private sector, and farm organizations. We have to seek the solutions together, and we have to work together. If money was found to bail out banks that were failing, then definitely money can be found to put in agriculture.
Yes. Jonathan and Amina as well, maybe you deal with this point because, you know, again, something that's been coming from the learning circles, something that's been coming from the floor, that people are getting fed up with experts kind of talking to them in a language that's all about development and fine things, but doesn't make a lot of sense on the ground. So what needs to be done from the top down to get those lines of communication going so the policy making is more responsive, is more genuine and does make more of a difference, because that's been the kind of frustration that people have been talking about as well.
Well, there's certainly a lot of paper, that's for sure. We've been trying to find a way to have this global conversation where we're informed about what the people want, the world we want. And one of the first things I've said is we need to define the we to begin with, because the first thing that happens is that we set up all these platforms and spaces for the experts. And we're not saying that, you know, knowledge and evidence and is not needed. It certainly is, but it needs to come from the country level, from the local level. We need to find a way to spend the time to try to make that systemic. I don't think it has been for a while. We wait until there's a couple of years to do something, and then we have a fire brigade attitude to it. I think there is urgency. I've heard that this afternoon, but I'd underscore that we've got no hurry to fail. And I think in the urgency, we hurry through things. We don't take people with us. So by the time we come back to them, not only do they not understand the language, we've got it wrong. And then we come back again and we go through the whole learning again. What's going to be different this time, I think, is what we have to ask, is in this consultation that we have over a period of 2.5 years, how are we going to pace that, and how are we going to involve people at the country level? The UN has started that process, and it still has a way to go. I think one of the things that perhaps we need to work on is representation, and representation in its different ways. We will never have the millions at the table. There has to be those that are responsible to bring those voices to the table. And I think that we often think government should be that voice, because in our democracies we have our parliamentarians. It's not always the case, and I think that we should continue to try to make that happen. I think it's an important entry point because, as I said, ultimately they will take the decisions. So I think at the local level we have to find a way to get our voices into those circles, whether they are within the sectors or our parliaments. Then I think we need to see much more work done with civil society, empowering them more to keep those spaces open and to be more inclusive, to give the capacities to come to the table to have that discussion. I think there is a disconnect between what happens at the local level and what happens here in the same way that we have in the United Nations.
Jonathan?
Right. So we really need a mix of solutions, because certainly many activities, many projects are implemented, and therefore success depends on the progress at the grassroots level. And so those activities have to involve input, ideas, knowledge, buy-in, ownership at the grassroots level. But by the same token, we also have learned over time that simply stitching together a whole series of local projects is inadequate. We need also systemic solutions, as was mentioned in one of the inputs from the past panel. And so there we need to be looking at policy frameworks. We need to be looking at agricultural value chains. What inputs are available for the farmers to utilize? So if the farmers are going to be using improved seeds, where do those seeds come from? And how can they have access to improved agricultural tools or fertilizers or other inputs? What markets can they sell into? What roads do they get access to get their goods from farm to market? So these require sometimes more than only grassroots solutions. And so we need this kind of comprehensive perspective. This is really something that where Africa has been one of the leading forces in teaching us all about development through the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program that was launched 10 years ago this year in Maputo, Mozambique, where the leaders committed to develop national agricultural development strategies, country investment plans that were multi-stakeholder vetted and developed, and that did have this kind of comprehensiveness that's necessary. But of course, in the implementation, you also need to have that reach into the grassroots to get input, buy-in, and ideas. And so it takes all.
There's an expression here in Irish politics, I don't know if it makes sense to people, that won't butter any parsnips. And it's an expression you'll hear from politicians sometimes when they're talking about something that it might be a very fine thing, but it's not going to make much difference to somebody in their ordinary life, in their ordinary kitchen, making their regular dinner that they need to eat. So how do we, you know, manage to come up with development goals, development policies that actually do butter more parsnips? Because that's what we're looking for here, Tony.
Right. Oh, sorry.
Oh yeah, no, you can come back in on this, John.
Yeah, go ahead. No, butter your parsnips. You butter them.
Well, so this is an example of the kind of integrated learning that's happened. And what does that buzzword mean? It means that we now know that nutrition matters crucially, centrally, so that growing more staple crops is important to fill bellies.
So from maize to peanuts.
But in addition, you need to make sure that you are producing sources of protein, such as peanuts, or adding some eggs or poultry or fish into the diet. And then also growing vegetables, such as parsnips or orange less sweet potatoes that we heard about in my learning circle yesterday, that add to the vitamin A content of the diet. So that then the mothers and their children can avoid night blindness and other maladies. And so then you're integrating the learning about nutrition and agricultural productivity and poverty alleviation all at once, and doing it in climate-smart ways.
And I mean, those practical examples, I'll actually come to you in a minute, Tony, but I want to bring in Dyborn on this, because when we were talking on Sunday about all this, I was talking to you in Utreda, and you were talking about exactly that, how moving to using different kind of crops and growing them in different ways had been of benefit to your community in Utreda, who'll be talking to us later, who's a farmer. And I was going, no, tell me exactly what kind of crops, I want to know what they are. When we're talking about integrated sustainable development goals, these are the kind of practical steps that we need. Will you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yes, thank you. In our case, it's legumes. Malawi has for a long time been dependent on maize for its food and on tobacco for its incomes. Up to maybe 3 years ago, as NASFAM, we were helping our farmers to diversify away from those systems, to diversify with those systems. But from about 4 years ago, we changed and said we must now start diversifying away from those systems. So we're working with CGIAR centers to give us the seed. ICRISAT is a typical example. And with support from Irish Aid, now we are doing conservation agriculture to make sure that farmers are not being negatively affected with climate change. So using the improved legume seed, we've seen that we are not only improving the nutrition of the soil, but also improving the nutrition of the farmers. And farmers are not able to make an extra income. We don't only sell the raw produce from the members, we do a bit of value-added processing, which is owned by the farmers, and we are selling products rather than selling produce.
That's fantastic. And that is integrated development, isn't it,
Absolutely.
Tony? That's exactly what it means.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah, and that's what we're looking for at the United Nations.
And
yes?
if I could jump in, it shows the power of markets and of essentially private sector activity to contribute to the solutions. If you want them to be sustainable, they need to be solutions that have their own self-reinforcing character, as opposed to relying on continued donor or government inputs. And so when you have things like, we just heard the example from Malawi, but down the road a bit in Mozambique, there's Lausanne Farms, which is one of the local companies that's part of the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition that the G8 and African leaders launched last year. And Lausanne Farms promotes nutrition-dense crops, such as the orange flesh sweet potato, soya, and other crops that can improve diets, and helps local farmers to adopt those and becomes a source of seeds or germplasm for those crops. So that you, again, have this self-reinforcing arrangement where a local firm is producing for the local farmers who are then either consuming the goods themselves or selling them into local markets.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned private industry, because that question we've asked a couple of times and you voted on, and you know, who do people represent? And I think Dick Blum was the 0. whatever percent for the private sector. It's notable who's not here. And you know, as we've been hearing again and again, everything is interlinked. So how do we get those powers and private business that aren't here to buy in and recognise that, you know, their development is linked to our development, and solving these problems is something that can really only happen in an integrated way. Over to you, panel, on that one, because that's a big question.
And again, just to reinforce, the new Alliance for Food Security and Nutrition involved over 60 companies that signed up last year. And the companies included large and small companies, African and global companies, that all committed to an approach that aligned behind country priorities. So in Tanzania, in Ethiopia, in Ghana, in Mozambique, in Cote d'Ivoire, and in Burkina Faso so far, companies, governments, donors have aligned behind a common set of priorities. And those are the priorities that came out of this multi-stakeholder process that CADP engineered in each of those countries to identify agricultural development priorities. And so it is evidence that companies can contribute positively to solutions to hunger and undernutrition.
Tony, do you want to come in on that?
I'd raised my hand about a much earlier point. I will say on this conversation, which is tremendously important, that we make a mistake sometimes in equating food security and nutrition security, because of course they are very different things. In many countries they're food secure and yet have very high stunting rates. But what you're talking about is how we can bring the two together. And we have to bring the two together because that's one of the most cost-efficient ways that we can proceed. I should add perhaps a small advertisement. I was a small farmer for many years, and I did not produce nutritious foods, but I did produce the best maple syrup in the world from Western Massachusetts, which is really good if you ever talk to me afterwards.
How are your pancakes as well? Do you make a good pancake?
Yeah, not so good.
All right.
But if I could I make the point I was going to make before? Because I think that we often miss something when we're talking about the importance of local empowerment, of local NGOs working together, and that is the transformative power of new information technologies. And as was impossible 10 years ago, now we are seeing around the world more and more the linkages among societies when 10 or 15 years ago it took governments to represent those societies to each other. Now, through the internet, local NGOs working with local NGOs across borders in movements and in their capacity then to reach others that we have never seen before. And I think we have to work harder to take advantage of all of that by forming virtual communities, by letting information technology help create the kinds of movements that can move political leadership. And I would hope after this really terrific conference, as good as any I've ever seen anywhere, that we then, as we leave, create these virtual communities, stay in touch with each other, and the UN has to become, I think, better at embracing this, although we're starting to. And one of the consultations that we had in getting ready for the post-2015 agenda under Amina's leadership on health, that was chaired by WHO, and we had a website, and we got tens of thousands of comments on what a health post-2015 development goal should look like. And 10 years ago, we never could have gotten all those tens of thousands of voices and listened to them. So let's keep linked up as we can through an information technology in a way my grandchildren can, and I have no idea how to do it myself.
I don't think anyone knew when they were inventing the mobile phone what a massive social revolution they were actually unleashing.
In so many ways.
Particularly, and nobody gets this, particularly in some of the fastest growing areas of the world which had been the least developed. I mean, this has been, talk to us a little bit, Dyborn, about the change even that simple piece of technology has made to your community.
It's been a huge change. When cell phones were introduced, even I as a CEO could not afford some of the technologies that were coming in. But now a cell phone can be afforded by even a simple farmer. I'm sure that even a trader has got one or two. And that's a massive tool that is being used for transferring information about markets, information about prices, information about what should be done at a particular time of year during the season. And that's just bridging the divide that there is between technology and advanced services reaching the smallholder farmers.
And has that been useful in developing the role of women? Because, again, this has been a constant theme throughout the conference. You know, if you empower the women, if you give the women the knowledge, from this, so much of the change and the resourcefulness will flow. Are mobile phones helping women? Is that helping?
I think we just have to keep asking the questions. When the NASFAM was forming, we had staff members who were the gender officers. So at each meeting, at each program, at each event happening, they were asking the question, is the gender being addressed here? Now the balance has changed, and it is the farmers themselves that are the gender officers and asking the questions to say, is what we are doing gender balanced and so on. So even with the use of mobile technology, it will not be us as staff that will be doing it. It will be themselves as farmers that will be demanding the services and making sure that it is happening.
I think my favourite quote of the conference was Cecilia Kibe yesterday. If you can't empower your wife, as the man told her he couldn't, to empower your mother and your sister at least. And it's an example of, you know, do something anyway. One thing that, and again it's been palpable throughout this conference, is this sense of frustration at the pace of change. You know, I wonder in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, will we be sitting around talking about the next set of goals for this, that and the other, and how we could better integrate them. And in the meantime, there will have been more extreme weather events that will have been putting, you know, communities in America, communities in Africa, communities in Asia, in Ireland. We are all suffering from this, but the vulnerable suffer most. And it seems that the weather is changing an awful lot faster than, you know, we as institutions and nations and globalizations are managing to do. So what do we do about the pace of change in the 21st century? Because, you know, institutionally we seem to have a lot of catching up to do. I'll give all of you in on that. Maybe, Amina, you take that.
Yeah, listening to all of this and the empowerment of communities, I think one of the missing gaps that we do have, and that sort of maybe speaks to the slow pace of change, is that we talk about political commitment from government, but actually institutional, the public officer that has to deal with delivering service for government is also left behind. And I think that, you know, we've seen many situations where we've got the resources, we can't spend the resources because the capacity there at the local level, at the higher up, are not able to do it. And you know, when I think about the things that need to go to scale and the capacity that governments need, even within their sectors, to have an integrated approach to deal with those investments, we are still quite far away. So I think that we need to be speaking to government of the need for that institutional memory and the systemic capacity that we need to build to make that change. We spoke recently about governance and accountability. This is going to be a big issue when it comes to partnering with business. Certainly if you're going to be looking to invest in the agricultural sector, and we don't want to leave anyone behind. And to do that, we're going to have to build those systems that will help us be accountable. I think they're very difficult to invest in. Nobody wants to invest in the public service. It's not something you can touch or feel. But without it, this is what happens. It will take you 10 years to do something that you could do in 2 if you don't engage those that have to deliver it with the latest technology, with the capacity to do these things.
Jonathan.
Well, I think to deal with the challenges that are increasing, there are several sources of leverage that we have to take advantage of. One of them is innovation. In this panel, we really haven't talked about the scientific research institutions that are so valuable in developing new breakthroughs in agricultural productivity or improved nutrition. And the key there is to then be ready to localize those solutions. And so that requires cooperation between the international research institutions and national and local level research institutes. And by the way, a short advertisement, we're going to be hosting a conference in the US at the end of this month on open data, which improves access globally to the data reservoirs that exist internationally in countries like my own, where we have a lot of scientific information that could be better utilized globally. We also need to focus on inclusion, and this gets back to the gender point that was made earlier. So I won't go deeper into that except to highlight it. We also need to focus on partnership. And there are all sorts of partnerships that can be pursued to achieve greater progress more rapidly. And those include things like the 1,000 Days Partnership that the government of Ireland and the US government launched to support the Sun movement on nutrition. focusing on the scientific learning that the critical development window in human development is the 1,000 days from pregnancy through age 2. It's partnerships that underlie the Feed the Future effort that is the U.S. government's primary food security and nutrition program, where we work in close partnership with the national and local governments in the countries in which we work. So let me pause there. Thank you.
Okay, good plug. Tony, your final word.
First, to come back to your point, very important. And when we're talking about innovations, again, many of them come through the cell phone, SMS texting, et cetera, and a very important point, they help us reach into the most disadvantaged, hardest to reach communities like never before. But on the general point of what do we do, let me just simply note, the United Nations, which people look to for leadership on the post-2015 agenda, and Amina and others are showing that leadership, is not an independent entity. It is subject to, it is the embodiment of the collective will of the member governments. And therefore, it is terribly important, as we discussed last night with some of you, that all of us not only are pushing our governments to do the right thing within our countries, but we have to be pushing governments to come together on problems like climate change that can only be solved through a global consensus. And to urge them not only to overcome their often parochial, short-sighted differences, to come together on a consensus, but to come behind a consensus on the post-2015 agenda, behind measurable, clear goals that the public can understand, so that we can have the same galvanizing effect after 2015 that the MDGs have had up until now. And I would remind us all that we have less than 1,000 days now before the report card on the MDGs comes through, another reason for urgency.
I think one of the links that struck me strongest was the small farmers from Africa and from the Arctic, discussing how global warming is impacting on each of them. So Dyborn, final word from you. In terms of the pace of change, the way we're responding to these problems, are you hopeful, or do you think it's all going far too slowly?
Far too slowly, and it gets frustrating. I've attended the last 4 COPs, and you think that you're just about to reach a solution, and then you find there is a division because they don't want agriculture to be at the center of it, or even if agriculture is at the center of it, other countries are talking mitigation, other countries are talking adaptation.
Okay.
When Etrida wakes up in the morning at 4 a.m. to go and work on her field, she doesn't think in her mind, today I'm going to do mitigation, and then wake up tomorrow and say, I'm going now to do adaptation. It's a package. And we would like to see political will and political commitment. First of all, to put agriculture at the center of these climate debates, and to have agreeable and something that every country can sign up to, because the weather is not waiting for us to make the decisions.
And you know what? Al Gore's not waiting for us either, so I'm going to have to thank you all at this stage. Dyborn, Tony, Jonathan, Amina, thank you so much for being such a good help. Thank you.